The rusted timber beam above Clara Miller's head groaned under the sheer weight of 60 panicked, surging bodies. Trapped against the splintered pine rails of Pen 12, a towering black buck with horns like twisted iron slammed his shoulder into her rib cage, pinning her against the iron latch as the herd surged in terror. The stench of stale manure, damp wool, and metallic fear filled her throat, suffocating and sharp. One slip of her mud-slicked work boot on the manure-caked barn floor would send her beneath 60 pairs of sharp cloven hooves that were already tearing into the earth. Outside the pen, a chorus of coarse male laughter echoed across the sale barn, but inside the dust-choked enclosure, Clara braced her shoulder against the buck's hot, matted flank, fighting for the breath to stand her ground. It was a cold, bitter Saturday morning in Ashe County, North Carolina, the kind of morning that smelled of coal smoke, wet tobacco, and impending frost. The sky outside the high transom windows of the livestock barn was the color of a bruised plum, casting a dull gray light over the rows of folding metal chairs filled with local cattlemen. They were men with calloused hands, stained caps, and eyes that had long since stopped looking for miracles in the soil. They had gathered to buy Angus calves and heavy draft horses, men who judged worth strictly by the hundredweight and the thickness of a prime loin. When the auctioneer finally reached the last pen at the far edge of the ring, he didn't bother to clear his throat or find his rhythmic hypnotic chant. He simply gestured with his wooden gavel toward the tangled mass of horns and matted hair crammed into the shadows. "Well, gentlemen, lot 52, the auctioneer droned, his voice flat with indifference. 60 head of whatever this is. Scrub stock off the old ridge property up Coldwater Way. Nobody's touched them in 2 years since the owner passed. Who'll start me at $5 for the lot?" A heavy rolling silence fell over the barn, broken only by the sharp crack of a match as a farmer lit a cigarette. In the third row, Silas Vance adjusted his wool coat over his broad shoulders. Silas was a man whose word carried the weight of a court order in Ashe County. He ran 400 head of pristine black Angus on the lush bottomland along the river, and he looked at the world through the cold calculus of yield per acre. "You couldn't pay me $4 to haul those ticks off the property," Silas called out, his voice booming effortlessly through the rafters. "They're wilder than coyotes and thinner than fence posts. Half of them look ready to die before sundown." The barn erupted in a collective chuckle, a dry, knowing sound shared by men who agreed that some things were simply beyond repair. In the back row, standing near the double wooden doors where the draft seeped in, 22-year-old Clara Miller didn't join in the laughter. She wore her late grandmother's heavy canvas jacket, the cuffs turned back twice to fit her wrists, and her hands were tucked deep into the fleece-lined pockets. She looked at the 60 wild creatures pressed against the back rail. She saw their matted coats and their long split hooves. Yes, but her eyes, gray and quiet, the exact shade of her grandfather Jacob's, looked deeper. She noticed that their eyes were bright and clear under the dust. She noticed their ribs were lean, not hollowed by disease, but hardened by 2 winters of surviving on frozen ridges where a cow would have starved in a week. They were not broken. They were wild, resilient, and utterly self-sufficient. The auctioneer raised his gavel, eager to move on. Going once, going twice, nobody wants him. Clara lifted 2 fingers off her knee. She didn't wave her hand or shout. She simply raised 2 fingers. The auctioneer squinted into the gloom of the back row, catching the movement. "Got $4 from the young lady in the canvas coat. $4 for the lot. Anybody got 4 1/4 said." Silas Vance turned all the way around in his folding chair, his thick neck creasing as he stared at Clara. Recognition registered on his face, followed quickly by a smirk of pity. "Honey," Silas said, loud enough for the entire ring to hear, "you just bought yourself the biggest $4 mistake in this county." The gavel came down with a sharp final thud. 2 hours later, getting the herd up the winding gravel road to Whispering Pines Hollow proved to be an education written in bruises and split lips. With the help of old Burl, a neighbor who charged her nothing, but shook his head the entire time they crammed 60 kicking, snorting goats into a borrowed stock trailer. When Clara finally backed the trailer to the gap in her grandfather's rotting fence line and dropped the wooden tailgate, she expected the animals to hesitate to sniff the air cautiously. Instead, the herd exploded out of the dark trailer like water bursting through a shattered dam. They hit the brush at the bottom of the upper field and vanished instantly, swallowed whole by a wall of invasive honeysuckle thickets of autumn olive and thorn-laden multiflora, rose that had choked out the mountain for 30 years. Burl leaned against the truck fender, spat into the weeds, and chuckled. "Well, Clara, there goes your $4. You'll never see 20 of them again." Clara stood by the fence post, her side aching where the black buck had thrown his weight against her earlier. She watched the green canopy shake as the herd pushed deeper into the jungle. She didn't feel panic. She felt a quiet, simmering curiosity. The 140 acres left to her by Jacob Miller was a stretch of steep, rocky ground that her own mother had spent 30 years describing as 100 acres of stone you couldn't grow a headache on. The local county agricultural agent had declared it worthless decades ago. But as Clara walked up the path toward the small cabin across the creek, she felt the weight of her grandfather's memory guiding her steps. Standing on the footbridge across the creek was Aunt Martha. At 86, Martha wore men's leather work boots, a faded wool cap, and a barn coat that had lost its color before Clara was born. She didn't offer a hug or words of welcome. She simply watched Clara approach, her dark, sharp eyes, taking in the mud on Clara's jeans and the split on her lip. "You got Jacob's eyes," Martha said softly, her voice like dry leaves scraping over stone. "And none of your mother's foolishness, I hope. We'll see if that holds when the first snow comes." "They're working already, Aunt Martha," Clara said, wiping a streak of dust from her cheek. "They're hungry," Martha corrected gently, turning toward her small porch. "There's a difference between a beast that's hungry and a beast that has a purpose. But keep your eyes open, child. This mountain hides things under all those thorns. Things your granddad remembered and things I've half forgotten." The next morning, before the mountain sun could burn the thick fog out of the low hollows, Clara walked up to the upper perimeter fence with her spiral notebook tucked under her arm. What she saw made her pause. The goats weren't eating the scant grass along the ditch. They walked right past it. Instead, they stood on their hind legs, stretching 6 feet into the air, stripping the thick, woody stems of the multiflora rose clean of leaves and bark. They chewed through thumb-thick briars with relentless, steady focus, their hard mouths unbothered by the sharpest thorns. They were clearing a path through the wilderness, inch by hard inch. Clara sat down on an old cedar stump, pulled out her pen, and began to write. She realized then that she hadn't bought 60 worthless strays. She had hired an army of 60 tireless workers who asked for no wages, who ate the very thickets, choking her inheritance, and who turned overgrown waste into progress day by day. Yet as she watched the black buck lead the herd deeper into a dense, dark ravine near the upper stone ledge, a place no human had walked in 50 years, Clara noticed the animals crowding around a dark depression in the earth, sniffing the damp soil where no water was supposed to be. Something buried beneath the decades of brush was waiting to be uncovered, and the $4 mistake was about to reveal a secret that would change the hollow forever. By the middle of May, the mountain began to surrender to the relentless appetite of 60 wild goats. What 30 years of neglect and 3 generations of men with bush hogs had failed to clear, the herd dismantled section by section. Clara Miller spent her early mornings moving the portable electric netting Burl had lent her, herding the animals across the steep terraces of Whispering Pines Hollow. She learned their rhythms, their hierarchy, and their peculiar intelligence. She knew that the rangy black buck, whom she had silently named Titan, would always test the brush first, and that a quiet cream-colored doe would lean her shoulder against Clara's knee whenever the fence was shifted. As the goats cleared quarter acre after quarter acre, stripping, the multiflora, rose, and honeysuckled down to the bare earth, the land began to yield its hidden history. Low, tumbled stone walls built by her great-great-grandfather emerged from the shadows of the briars like ribs rising from forgotten earth. Clara walked behind the herd with her spiral notebook, mapping every exposed ledge, every old cedar stump, and every shift in the terrain. The first practical reward of her investment came unexpectedly in June. The wild does, which had bred on the upper ridge the previous autumn, began dropping kids in the high pastures. Clara, who had never delivered livestock in her life, spent sleepless nights carrying damp, trembling kids wrapped in her grandmother's canvas coat down to the dry safety of the barn. Within 3 weeks, 34 healthy kids were running alongside the herd. Instead of hauling the new stock to the county sale barn to be dismissed by local men, Clara took a different approach. She borrowed a camera, snapped clear photographs of the pristine, weed-free pastures the goats had carved out of the wilderness, and posted them online with a simple description of their land-clearing capabilities. The response was immediate. Smallholders across Ashe County and neighboring Virginia, struggling with overgrown orchards and choking briar patches, saw what 60 goats could accomplish on terrain no tractor could touch. Within 10 days, Clara sold 24 kids at 4 times the price the auction barn would have offered. She placed the folded bills inside a heavy glass jar on her kitchen counter, watching the modest pile grow. In the feed store down in town, Silas Vance and the old cattleman no longer cracked jokes when Clara walked in for grain. They watched her in a heavy, thoughtful silence. Yet it was in late August that the true secret of Whispering Pines Hollow began to unspool. The goats had cleared a high, shaded shelf of ground on the mountain's northeast slope, a bench of land tucked under a towering granite ledge that Clara had never been able to reach on foot. Calling Titan and the herd to a lower pen with a shaken can of corn, Clara climbed the newly opened slope. Half buried under 80 years of leaf mold rotting logs and tangled vines lay a rectangular structure built of dry-laid fieldstone. 4 courses of stone still stood on the uphill side, framing a hand-carved trough cut out of a single massive block of mountain granite. Clara knelt beside the trough, brushing away decades of damp black earth with her bare hands. The stone was cool, smooth, and dry, but set deeply into the slope above. It was a stone-lined channel that vanished into the hillside. A footstep crunched on the gravel behind her. Aunt Martha stood at the edge of the cleared bench, leaning lightly on a hickory walking stick. The old woman looked at the stone trough for a long time, her sharp eyes softening as if gazing through a veil of decades. "I haven't stood on this bench since I was 7 years old," Martha said softly, her dry voice barely louder than the rustle of the summer leaves. "Your great-great-grandfather built this spring house with his own 2 hands. It held the coldest, sweetest water in the entire county. Farmers used to drive wagons 3 miles just to fill wooden kegs from that stone trough." Clara looked into the dry channel. "What happened to it?" "1934, Martha replied, placing her palm flat against the granite ledge. "A spring quake shook the ridge in the middle of April. By morning, the water had quit. The trough ran dry, the brush took the bench, and after 40 years, people stopped talking about it. They figured the mountain had taken its gift back." That evening, with an oil lamp flickering on the kitchen table, Clara brought out the cracked leather ledger she had pulled from the bottom of her grandfather Jacob's old wooden trunk. She turned the yellowed pages, reading his small, precise handwriting. Threaded between cattle prices and hay yields were dozens of entries about the spring house. Then she found the entry dated May 2nd, 1934. "Earthquake moved the ridge. The upper spring quit running. Search reveals no surface break." Below it, written 30 years later in Jacob's fading blue ink, was a single line that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. "Water does not leave a mountain. It only moves. Someday it will show itself again to someone who knows how to watch." Clara copied her grandfather's words into her spiral notebook, underlining them twice. The answer came on a freezing morning in early November. A sudden Arctic cold front swept across the Blue Ridge, coating every tree, rock, and blade of grass in a thick layer of white frost. Clara pulled her coat tight and walked up the perimeter line to inspect the herd. As she crested the rise below the old spring house, she stopped dead in her tracks. The entire mountain was draped in brilliant, sparkling white, except for a rough, oval patch of ground roughly 30 feet wide, sitting lower on the slope to the east of the collapsed channel. On that single patch of earth, no frost had formed. The ground steamed gently in the frigid morning air, dark, rich, and warm against the surrounding ice. Clara ran down the slope and knelt in the center of the unfrosted soil. She pressed her bare palm against the earth. It was warm and saturated with moisture, pulsing with a deep subterranean life. The mountain hadn't lost the water 80 years ago. The quake had simply redirected the underground vein, burying it deep beneath the surface, until the goats stripped away the heavy blanket of brush that had hidden the earth's natural warmth. Calling young Caleb from down the road, who brought his small farm excavator up the hollow, they spent 3 careful days digging into the bank above the steaming ground, following the line of Jacob's old notes. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the steel bucket broke through a ledge of shale. A clear, powerful torrent of water burst from the rock wall. Not a muddy trickle, but a rushing stream so cold it made Clara's hand ache to the bone when she cupped it to her lips. It ran down the stone channel Caleb laid clean, sweet, and unstoppable, filling the mountain air with the long-forgotten music of rushing water. Clara filled her first glass bottle directly from the spring, pasting a handwritten paper label across the front, "Cold Water Spring Lost, 1934, Found Again." She didn't know it then as she stood watching the water carve its new path down toward the barn, but as the sky darkened to the deep gray of an approaching winter storm, That very stream of water and the resilient herd that had revealed it was about to become the only thread keeping Whispering Pines Hollow alive. By the second week of December, the sky above Ashe County turned the heavy bruised purple of an impending Arctic disaster. The weather reports broadcasted frantic warnings from Atlanta to Richmond, but up in Whispering Pines Hollow, the mountain air spoke its own harsh truth. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in 6 hours, freezing the newly cleared soil solid and wringing the high ridges with a razor-sharp wind. When the storm hit, it did not arrive as soft drifting snow. It slammed into the Blue Ridge Mountains as a furious, suffocating whiteout, a historic blizzard that the local radio station would later call the Great Frost of '26. Within 24 hours, 4 feet of dense, wind-driven snow buried the road, snapping pine branches like dry tinder and bringing down the county's main power grid. The electric lines that fed the valleys groaned under ice and shattered, leaving Whispering Pines and every surrounding farm stranded in total darkness, cut off from the rest of North Carolina. Down in the valley, modern farming operations collapsed into chaos. Commercial cattlemen who relied on electric heat lamps, automated well pumps, and clear tractor paths found themselves helpless. Massive drifts blocked the barn doors, freezing water troughs solid within hours and trapping cattle in ice-caked enclosures. Up on Clara Miller's Ridge, however, 60 wild goats had spent 2 years mastering the art of mountain survival. As the blizzard howled through the timber, Titan led the herd away from the exposed fences and straight toward the high bench. Instinct guided them to the stone springhouse alcove, where the earth around the freshly opened spring remained naturally warm. The geothermal heat radiating from the underground stream kept the surrounding stone room well above freezing, and the thick canopy of ancient hemlocks blocked the worst of the driving snow. Protected from the gale, the 60 goats hunkered down together, their thick winter coats trapping their body heat. Because they had grazed all autumn on the nutrient-dense wild herbs, pine needles, and deep mountain roots revealed during the clearing, the nursing does were thriving. Their udders were full, rich, and heavy with warm milk. On the third morning of the lockout, the storm finally broke, leaving behind a silent, sparkling landscape of absolute frost. The temperature sat at 12 below zero. Clara strapped on her grandfather's old ashwood snowshoes, pulling her grandmother's canvas coat tight against the bitter air. With Caleb clearing a narrow path beside her using a heavy shovel, they climbed up to the springhouse. When Clara opened the rough timber door Caleb had built over the entrance, she was greeted not by frozen carcasses, but by the comforting, humid warmth of 60 healthy animals. The spring water flowed steadily through its stone channel, steam rising from the clear current unbothered by the ice outside. "Look at 'em, Clara." Caleb breathed, his vapor clouds thick in the air. "They aren't just surviving this, they're fat and warm." Clara knelt beside the cream-colored doe, rubbing the animal's frosty ears. "They're giving milk, Caleb. Lots of it." It took less than an hour for the urgency of the situation to hit them. Caleb's handheld ham radio crackled to life with desperate distress calls from down the mountain. Households were running out of fuel, water pipes had burst across the county, and families with young children had been without heat or fresh food for 3 days. Emergency crews were stuck 20 miles away in town, unable to move through the 6-foot snowdrifts choking the narrow, hollow roads. "We can't sit here," Clara said, her eyes darkening with resolve. Using an old wooden hand sled Jacob had built decades ago, Clara and Caleb loaded 24 heavy glass jars. Half were filled with steaming, fresh goat's milk, rich, sweet, and packed with vital calories. The other half carried crystal-clear, unfrozen water dipped directly from the warm spring. Traversing the buried landscape on snowshoes, Clara and Caleb became a lifeline. They moved silently through the snow-blanketed valley, dropping off warm milk and drinkable water at isolated cabins, where elderly neighbors sat wrapped in blankets beside dying wood fires. For 2 days, the mountain that everyone had considered a barren rock supplied the only fresh nourishment in the hollow. On the afternoon of the 5th day, their sled tracks led them to the grand white gates of the Vance Angus farm. The sprawling property, usually a testament to wealth and efficiency, looked like a graveyard of frozen machinery. Silas Vance's heavy diesel tractors sat dead in the drifts, their fuel lines gelled by the extreme cold. As Clara stepped onto the porch of the main house, the front door swung open. Silas Vance stood in the doorway, but he was not the boisterous, arrogant man who had commanded the auction ring months ago. His face was gray with exhaustion, his shoulders slouched inside an oversized quilt, and his eyes were hollowed by fear. Behind him, inside the freezing living room, his daughter sat by a cold hearth, cradling a feverish 3-year-old girl in her arms. "Clara," Silas rasped, his voice cracking. The Grand Cattleman looked at the wooden sled, then at the young woman wearing the worn canvas coat. The power's been out 4 days. My well pump froze and shattered on Tuesday. My granddaughter, she can't keep down the dry rations we have left. She needs liquid Clara. Warm liquid. Clara didn't say a word. She stepped across the threshold, reached into the fleece-lined pocket of her coat, and pulled out a wide-mouthed jar of warm goat's milk, still radiating heat from the spring house, alongside a sealed bottle of spring water. She handed them directly to Silas. The big man's calloused hands shook as he took the glass. He stared at the rich, creamy milk, then up at Clara. He remembered the auction barn. He remembered laughing in front of a room full of men telling her she had bought the biggest $4 mistake in Ashe County. Silas sank slowly into a wooden kitchen chair, holding the jar as if it were made of spun gold. Tears cut clean tracks through the soot and dust on his weathered cheeks. "I swore those animals were useless, Clara," Silas whispered, his chest heaving as his daughter hastily poured the warm milk into a child's cup. "I swore this mountain was dead stone, and here you are, bringing life out of the cold to save my family." "Nothing useful comes from nothing useful, Silas," Clara said softly, repeating the phrase he had spoken at the feed store months ago, though her voice held no malice, only the quiet, unyielding weight of truth. "That's what they say, but sometimes you just have to know where to look." Silas covered his face with his hands and wept quietly as his granddaughter drank thirstily beside the hearth. Outside, as Clara pulled the wooden sled back onto the main ridge trail, the heavy winter clouds began to part for the first time in a week. A brilliant beam of late-afternoon sunlight struck the high peak of Whispering Pines Hollow, illuminating the dark green patch where the spring ran free, melting the ice and clearing a path for whatever was yet to come. When the spring thaw finally broke the spine of winter in late March, the ice melted off the Blue Ridge roads to reveal a valley forever altered. Whispering Pines Hollow, once written off by county officials as an unprofitable graveyard of rock, had become the beating heart of Ashe County. The story of the $4 herd that had survived the blizzard yielded warm milk in a freezing wilderness, and unburied a forgotten spring moved down the mountain like wild water. It was carried by word of mouth from porch to porch, and eventually into the regional newspapers, bringing a steady stream of visitors up the gravel road. People didn't just come to buy the bottled water. They came to see the place where a lost world had been brought back to light. Clara Miller never placed a single advertisement. She didn't need to. Every bottle of cold water spring, sealed by hand in plain glass with its simple paper label, carried the proof of the mountain's revival. Local grocers couldn't keep it on their shelves, and farmers from 3 neighboring counties queued up at her gate waiting to rent or buy young goats descended from the original 60 to clear their own choking briar patches. On a bright Tuesday morning in early May, a dust cloud rose along the hollow road as a heavy pickup truck pulled past the footbridge. Silas Vance stepped out of the cab. He walked slowly toward the spring house where Clara was filling a wooden crate with fresh glass bottles. He wore a clean flannel shirt, but he moved with a new, quiet humility that had stayed with him since the night of the storm. He stood by the stone trough for a long time, watching the crystal-clear water rush over the granite lip, catching the morning sun. "My daddy used to tell stories about this spring when I was 10 years old," Silas said, his deep voice carrying softly over the sound of the running water. "I thought he was just dreaming up tales to make a poor farm sound rich. I spent 30 years looking at this mountain through the price of beef and the cost of feed, thinking anything that didn't yield a quick dollar was worthless." Clara set a glass bottle into the crate and wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the seasoned cattleman, offering a quiet nod. "It's easy to look at a hard place and only see what's missing, Silas." Silas turned to look up at the high ridge where Titan and the 60 goats were working their way across an overgrown upper terrace, stripping away years of dead brush to reveal another run of ancient stone wall. "I came to tell you I was wrong, Clara," Silas said, looking her directly in the eye without a trace of his former arrogance. "I stood in that auction barn and called those animals the biggest mistake in this county. The truth is, I was the fool. You saw what the rest of us were too blind to notice." He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a checkbook, and handed Clara a folded slip of paper. "I'm clearing 200 acres of ridge behind my place this summer. I want 40 of your young goats, and I'm paying full price. And I'd consider it a favor if you'd let me buy 10 cases of this water every month for my crew." Clara looked at the check, then extended her hand. "Deal, Silas. I'll show Caleb how to set up the netting on your ridge tomorrow." They shook hands, a firm, quiet agreement between two neighbors who finally understood the true measure of the land beneath their feet. As the summer blossomed into full warmth, Aunt Martha's long journey came to its gentle natural end. At 88 years old, having lived to see her family's legacy restored and the mountain brought back to life, she spent her final week sitting on the front porch across the creek, listening to the music of the spring. On an afternoon in mid-July, Martha drank a small glass of the cold spring water, closed her eyes in the warm mountain breeze, and passed away peacefully in her sleep, wearing her worn wool cap until the very end. They buried her beside Jacob on the high sunlit shoulder of the mountain, a spot on the cleared green slope where the trees framed a sweeping view of the entire valley below. On the morning of the funeral, the entire county came up the hollow. Men from the feed store town, merchant apprentice Cyrus Caleb and Silas Vance, stood shoulder to shoulder in silence. There was no frost on the earth that day, only a blanket of wild clover and soft grass brought back by the grazing herd. As the pastor finished his prayer, Clara stood by her grandparents' graves, looking out over the 140 acres of whispering pines. The land was no longer a tangled jungle of thorns and forgotten regrets. It was an open, thriving landscape that supported 5 local families, supplied clean water to 4 counties, and proved that worth is never truly lost. It only waits for someone patient enough to look for it. That evening, with the warm twilight settling over the ridge, Clara sat at her kitchen table. The house was quiet, filled only with the soft ticking of the wood stove and the distant rhythmic chime of goat bells on the high pasture. She opened her grandfather Jacob's cracked black ledger. She turned past the faded entries of 1934, past his line about the water that only moves, and opened to a fresh white page. Taking up her pen, Clara wrote in her clear, steady hand, May 2026. The upper spring flows through the stone trough day and night, sweeter than ever. The herd has grown to 200, clearing the valley ridge by ridge. Found the water where Jacob said it would be, in ground everyone had given up on, brought back by 60 wild animals everyone laughed at. True worth is never given by the crowd. It is revealed through patience, work, and faith in things that endure. She let the ink dry in the soft amber glow of the lamp, closed the heavy leather book, and walked out onto the porch. The night sky over Ashe County was clear and brilliant, carpeted with thousands of sharp stars. Down in the hollow, the cold spring water sparkled under the moonlight, flowing steadily down the mountain, carrying life, memory, and promise into a future that would never forget its name again.